Approaching abjection. No beast is there without glimmer of infinity, no eye so vile nor abject that brushes not against lightning from on high, now tender, now fierce. Victor Hugo, La Legende des Siècles. Neither subject nor object. There looms, within abjection, one of those violent, dark revolts of being, directed against a threat that seems to emanate from an exorbitant outside or inside, ejected beyond the scope of the possible, the tolerable, the thinkable. It lies there, quite close, but it cannot be assimilated. It beseeches, worries, and fascinates desire, which nevertheless does not let itself be seduced. Apprehensive, desire turns aside. Sickened, it rejects. A certainty protects it from the shameful. A certainty of which it is proud holds on to it. A certainty of which it is proud holds on to it. But simultaneously, just the same, that impetus, that spasm, that leap is drawn toward and elsewhere, as tempting as it is condemned. Unflaggingly, like an inescapable boomerang, a vortex of summons and repulsion places the one haunted by it literally beside himself. When I am beset by abjection, the twisted braid of affects and thoughts I call by such a name does not have, properly speaking, a definable object. The abject is not an object facing me, which I name or imagine, nor is it an object, an otherness ceaselessly fleeing in a systematic quest of desire. What is abject is not my correlative, which, providing me with someone or something else as support, would allow me to be more or less detached and autonomous. The abject has only one quality of the object, that of being opposed to I. If the object, however, through its opposition, settles me within the fragile texture of a desire of meaning, which, as a matter of fact, makes me ceaselessly and infinitely homologous to it. What is abject, on the contrary, the jettisoned object, is radically excluded and draws me toward the place where meaning collapses. A certain ego, that merged with its master, a superego, has flatly driven it away. It lies outside, beyond the set, and does not seem to agree with the latter's rules of the game. And yet, from its place of banishment, the abject does not cease challenging its master. Without a sign for him, it beseeches a discharge, a convulsion, a crying out. To each ego its object, to each superego its abject. It is not the white expanse or slack boredom of repression, not the translations and transformations of desire that wrench bodies, nights, and discourse. Rather, it is a brutish suffering that I puts up with, sublime and devastated, for I deposits it to the Father's account. Vers au Père, per Perusian. I endure it, for I imagine that such is the desire of the other. A massive and sudden emergence of uncanniness, which, familiar as it might have been in an opaque and forgotten life, now harries me as radically separate, loathsome. Not me, not that, but not nothing either, a something that I do not recognize as a thing, a weight of meaninglessness about which there is nothing insignificant, and which crushes me. On the edge of non-existence and hallucination, of a reality that, if I acknowledge it, annihilates me. There, abject and abjection are my safeguards, the primers of my culture. The improper, unclean. Loathing an item of food, a piece of filth, waste, or dung. The spasms and vomiting that protect me. The repugnance, the retching that thrusts me to the side and turns me away from defilement, sewage, and muck. The shame of compromise, of being in the middle of treachery. The fascinated start that leads me toward and separates me from them. Food loathing is perhaps the most elementary and most archaic form of abjection. When the eyes see or the lips touch the skin on the surface of milk, harmless, thin as a sheet of cigarette paper, pitiful as a nail paring, I experience a gagging sensation and, still farther down, spasms in the stomach, the belly, and all the organs shrivel up the body, provoke tears and bile, increase heartbeat, cause forehead and hands to perspire. Along with sight-clouding dizziness, nausea makes me balk at that milk cream, separates me from the mother and father who proffer it. I want none of that element, sign of their desire. I do not want to listen. I do not assimilate it. I expel it. But since the food is not an other for me, who am only in their desire, I expel myself. I spit myself out. I object myself within the same motion through which I claim to establish myself. That detail, perhaps an insignificant one, but one that they ferret out, emphasize, evaluate, that trifle turns me inside out, got sprawling. It is thus that they see that I am in the process of becoming another, at the expense of my own death. During that course in which I become, I give birth to myself amid the violence of sobs, of vomit, mute protest of the symptom, shattering violence of a convulsion that, to be sure, is inscribed in a symbolic system, but in which, without either wanting or being able to become integrated in order to answer to it, it reacts, it abreacts, it abjects. The corpse, or cadaver, cadere, to fall, that which has irremediably come to a cropper, immediately come a cropper, is cesspool and death. It upsets even more violently the one who confronts it as fragile and fallacious chance. A wound with blood and pus, or the sickly acrid smell of sweat, of decay, does not signify death. It is the presence of signified death. A flat encephalograph, for instance, I would understand, react, or accept. No, as in true theater, without makeup or masks, refuse and corpses show me what I permanently thrust aside in order to live. These body fluids, this defilement, this shit are what life withstands, hardly and with difficulty, on the part of death. There, I am at the border of my condition as a living being. My body extricates itself, as being alive, from that border. Such waste drops so that I might live until, from loss to loss, nothing remains in me and my entire body falls beyond the limit. Cadere, cadaver. If dung signifies the other side of the border, the place where I am not, and which permits me to be, the corpse, the most sickening of wastes, is a border that has encroached upon everything. It is no longer I who expel, I is expelled. The border has become an object. How can I be without border? That elsewhere that I imagine beyond the present, or that I hallucinate so that I might, in a present time, speak to you, conceive of you, it is now here, jetted, abjected into my world. Deprived of world, therefore, I fall in a faint. In that compelling, raw, insolent thing in the morgue's full sunlight, in that thing that no longer matches, and therefore no longer signifies anything, I behold the breaking down of a world that has erased its borders, fainting away. The corpse, seen without God and outside of science, is the utmost of abjection. It is death infecting life. Abject. It is something rejected from which one does not part, from which one does not protect oneself as from an object. Imaginary uncanniness and real threat, it beckons to us and ends up engulfing us. It is thus not lack of cleanliness or health that causes abjection, but what disturbs identity, system, order. What does not respect borders, positions, rules, the in-between, the ambiguous, the composite, the traitor, the liar, the criminal with a good conscience, the shameless rapist, the killer who claims he is a savior. Any crime, because it draws attention to the fragility of the law, is abject, but premeditated crime, cunning murder, hypocritical revenge are even more so because they heighten the display of such fragility. He who denies morality is not abject. There can be grandeur in amorality and even in crime that flaunts its disrespect for the law. Rebellious, liberating, and suicidal crime. Abjection, on the other hand, is immoral, sinister, scheming, and shady, a terror that dissembles, a hatred that smiles, a passion that uses the body for barter instead of inflaming it, a debtor who sells you up, a friend who stabs you. In the dark halls of the museum that is now what remains of Auschwitz, I see a heap of children's shoes, or something like that, something I have already seen elsewhere, under a Christmas tree, for instance, dolls, I believe. The abjection of Nazi crime reaches its apex when death, which, in any case, kills me, interferes with what, in my living universe, is supposed to save me from death: childhood, science, among other things. The abjection of self. If it be true that the abject simultaneously beseeches and pulverizes the subject, one can understand that it is experienced at the peak of its strength when that subject, weary of fruitless attempts to identify with something on the outside, finds the impossible within, when it finds that the impossible constitutes its very being, that is none other than abject. The abjection of self would be the culminating form of that experience of the subject to which it is revealed that all its objects are based merely on the inaugural loss that laid the foundations of its own being. There is nothing like the abjection of self to show that all abjection is in fact recognition of the want on which any being, meaning, language, or desire is founded. One always passes too quickly over this word, want, and today's psychoanalysts are finally taking into account only its more or less fetishized product, the object of want. But if one imagines, and imagine one must, for it is the working of imagination whose foundations are being laid here, the experience of want itself, as logically preliminary to being and object, to the being of the object, then one understands that abjection, and even more so abjection of self, is its only signified. Its signifier, then, is none but literature. Mystical Christendom turned this abjection of self into the ultimate proof of humility before God. Witness Elizabeth of Hungary, who, though a great princess, delighted in nothing so much as in abasing herself. The question remains as to the ordeal, a secular one this time, that abjection can constitute for someone who, in what is termed knowledge of castration, turning away from perverse dodges, presents himself with his own body and ego as the most precious non-objects. They are no longer seen in their own right, but forfeited, abject. The termination of analysis can lead us there, as we shall see. Such are the pangs and delights of masochism. Essentially different from uncanniness, more violent too, abjection is elaborated through a failure to recognize its kin. Nothing is familiar, not even the shadow of a memory. I imagine a child who has swallowed up his parents too soon, who frightens himself on that account, all by himself, and, to save himself, rejects and throws up everything that is given to him, all gifts, all objects. He could have, a sense of the abject, even before things for him are. Hence, before they are signifiable, he drives them out, dominated by drive as he is, and constitutes his own territory, edged by the abject, a sacred configuration. Fear cements his compound, conjoined to another world, thrown up, driven out, forfeited. What he has swallowed up instead of maternal love is an emptiness, or rather a maternal hatred without a word for the words of the Father. That is what he tries to cleanse himself of tirelessly. What solace does he come upon within such loathing? Perhaps a father, existing but unsettled, loving but unsteady, merely an apparition but an apparition that remains. Without him, the holy brat would probably have no sense of the sacred. A blank subject, he would remain, discomfited, at the dump for non-objects that are always forfeited, from which, on the contrary, fortified by abjection, he tries to extricate himself. For he is not mad, he through whom the abject exists. Out of the daze that has petrified him before the untouchable, impossible, absent body of the mother, a daze that has cut off his impulses from their objects, that is, from their representations, out of such daze he causes, along with loathing, one word to crop up: fear. The phobic has no other object than the abject. But that word, fear, a fluid haze, an elusive clamminess, no sooner has it cropped up than it shakes off like a mirage and permeates all words of the language with non-existence, with a hallucinatory, ghostly glimmer. Thus, fear having been bracketed, discourse will seem tenable only if it ceaselessly confronts that otherness, a burden both repellent and repelled, a deep well of memory that is unapproachable and intimate, the abject, beyond the unconscious. Put another way, it means that there are lives not sustained by desire, as desire is always for objects. Such lives are based on exclusion. They are clearly distinguishable from those understood as neurotic or psychotic, articulated by negation and its modalities, transgression, denial, and repudiation. Their dynamics challenges the theory of the unconscious, seeing that the latter is dependent upon a dialectic of negativity. The theory of the unconscious, as is well known, presupposes a repression of contents, affects, and presentations that thereby do not have access to consciousness, but effect within the subject modifications, either of speech, parapraxis, etc., or of the body, symptoms, or both, hallucinations, etc. As correlative to the notion of repression, Freud put forward that of denial as a means of figuring out neurosis, that of rejection, repudiation, as a means of situating psychosis. The asymmetry of the two repressions becomes more marked owing to denial's bearing on the object, whereas repudiation affects desire itself. Lacan, in perfect keeping with Freud's thought, interprets that as repudiation of the name of the Father. Yet, facing the abject, and more specifically phobia, and the splitting of the ego, a point I shall return to, one might ask if those articulations of negativity germane to the unconscious, inherited by Freud from philosophy and psychology, have not become inoperative. The unconscious contents remain here excluded, but in strange fashion, not radically enough to allow for a secure differentiation between subject and object, and yet clearly enough for a defensive position to be established, one that implies a refusal but also a sublimating elaboration, as if the fundamental opposition were between I and other, or, in more archaic fashion, between inside and outside, as if such an opposition subsumed the one between conscious and unconscious, elaborated on the basis of neurosis. Owing to the ambiguous opposition, I, other, inside, outside, an opposition that is vigorous but pervious, violent but uncertain, there are contents, normally unconscious in neurotics, that become explicit if not conscious in borderline patient speeches and behavior. Such contents are often openly manifested through symbolic practices without, by the same token being integrated into the judging consciousness of those particular subjects. Since they make the conscious-unconscious distinction irrelevant, borderline subjects and their speech constitute propitious ground for a sublimating discourse, aesthetic or mystical, etc., rather than a scientific or rationalist one. An exile who asks, where? The one by whom the abject exists is thus a deject who places himself, separates himself, situates himself, and therefore strays instead of getting his bearings, desiring, belonging, or refusing. Situationist in a sense, and not without laughter, since laughing is a way of placing or displacing abjection. Necessarily dichotomous, somewhat Manichaean, he divides, excludes, and without, properly speaking, wishing to know his abjections, is not at all aware of them. Often, moreover, he includes himself among them, thus casting within himself the scalpel that carries out his separations. Instead of sounding himself as to his being, he does so concerning his place. Where am I, instead of who am I? For the space that engrosses the deject, the excluded, is never one, nor homogeneous, nor totalizable, but essentially divisible, foldable, and catastrophic. A divisor of territories, languages, works, the deject never stops demarcating his universe whose fluid confines, for they are constituted of a non-object, the abject, constantly question his solidity and impel him to start afresh. A tireless builder, the deject is in short a stray. He is on a journey during the night, the end of which keeps receding. He has a sense of the danger, of the loss of that pseudo-object. Attracting him represents for him, but he cannot help taking the risk at the very moment he sets himself apart, and the more he strays, the more he is saved. Time, forgetfulness, and thunder. For it is out of such straying on excluded ground that he draws his jouissance. The abject from which he does not cease separating is for him, in short, a land of oblivion that is constantly remembered. Once upon blotted out time, the abject must have been a magnetized pole of covetousness, but the ashes of oblivion now serve as a screen and reflect aversion, repugnance. The clean and proper, in the sense of incorporated and incorporable, becomes filthy. The sought after turns into the banished, fascination into shame. Then, forgotten time crops up suddenly and condenses into a flash of lightning, an operation that, if it were thought out, would involve bringing together the two opposite terms, but, on account of that flash, is discharged like thunder. The time of abjection is double, a time of oblivion and thunder, of veiled infinity and the moment when revelation bursts forth. Jouissance and affect. Jouissance, in short. For the stray considers himself as equivalent to a third party. He secures the latter's judgment. He acts on the strength of its power in order to condemn. He grounds himself on its law to tear the veil of oblivion, but also to set up its object as inoperative, as jettisoned, parachuted by the other, a ternary structure, if you wish, held in keystone position by the other, but a structure that is skewed, a topology of catastrophe, for having provided itself with an alter ego. The other no longer has a grip on the three apices of the triangle where subjective homogeneity resides, and so it jettisons the object into an abominable real, inaccessible except through jouissance. It follows that jouissance alone causes the object to exist as such. One does not know it, one does not desire it, one joys in it, en enjouit, violently and painfully, a passion, and as in jouissance where the object of desire, known as object A in Lacan's terminology, bursts with the shattered mirror where the ego gives up its image in order to contemplate itself in the other, there is nothing either objective or objectal to the object. It is simply a frontier, a repulsive gift that the other, having become alter ego, drops so that I does not disappear in it but finds, in that sublime alienation, a forfeited existence. Hence a jouissance in which the subject is swallowed up, but in which the other, in return, keeps the subject from foundering by making it repugnant. One thus understands why so many victims of the abject are its fascinated victims, if not its submissive and willing ones. We may call it a border. Abjection is above all ambiguity, because, while releasing a hold, it does not radically cut off the subject from what threatens it. On the contrary, abjection acknowledges it to be in perpetual danger, but also because abjection itself is a composite of judgment and affect, premises of the sign, linings of the sublime. Let us pause for a while at this juncture. If the object is already a wellspring of sign for a non-object, on the edges of primal repression, one can understand it skirting the somatic symptom on the one hand and sublimation on the other. The symptom, a language that gives up, a structure within the body, a non-assimilable alien, a monster, a tumor, a cancer that the listening devices of the unconscious do not hear, for its strayed subject is huddled outside the paths of desire. Sublimation, on the contrary, is nothing else than the possibility of naming the pronominal, the pre-objectal, which are in fact only a transnominal, a transobjectal. In the symptom, the abject permeates me. I become abject. Through sublimation, I keep it under control. The abject is edged with the sublime. It is not the same moment on the journey, but the same subject and speech bring them into being. For the sublime has no object either. When the starry sky, a vista of open seas, or a stained glass window shedding purple beams fascinate me, there is a cluster of meaning, of colors, of words, of caresses. There are light touches, scents, sighs, cadences that arise, shroud me, carry me away, and sweep me beyond the things that I see, hear, or think. The sublime object dissolves in the raptures of a bottomless memory. It is such a memory which, from stopping point to stopping point, remembrance to remembrance, love to love, transfers that object to the refulgent point of the dazzlement in which I stray in order to be. As soon as I perceive it, as soon as I name it, the sublime triggers. It has always already triggered a spree of perceptions and words that expands memory boundlessly. I then forget the point of departure and find myself removed to a secondary universe, set off from the one where I am, delight and loss, not at all short of, but always with and through perception and words. The sublime is a something added that expands us, overstrains us, causes us to be both here as dejects and there as others and sparkling. A divergence, an impossible bounding, everything missed, joy, fascination. Before the beginning, separation. The abject might then appear as the most fragile from a synchronic point of view, the most archaic from a diachronic one. subliminal of an object still inseparable from drives. The abject is that pseudo-object that is made up before but appears only within the gaps of secondary repression. The abject would thus be the object of primal repression. But what is primal repression? Let us call it the ability of the speaking being, always already haunted by the other, to divide, reject, repeat, without one division, one separation, one subject, object, having been constituted, not yet, or no longer yet. Why? Perhaps because of maternal anguish, unable to be satiated within the encompassing symbolic. The abject confronts us, on the one hand, with those fragile states where man strays on the territories of animal. Thus, by way of objection, primitive societies have marked out a precise area of their culture in order to remove it from the threatening world of animals or animalism, which were imagined as representatives of sex and murder. The abject confronts us, on the other hand, and this time within our personal archaeology, with our earliest attempts to release the hold of maternal entity even before existing outside of her, thanks to the autonomy of language. It is a violent, clumsy breaking away, with the constant risk of falling back under the sway of a power as securing as it is stifling. The difficulty a mother has in acknowledging, or being acknowledged by, the symbolic realm, in other words, the problem she has with the phallus that her father or her husband stands for, is not such as to help the future subject leave the natural mansion. The child can serve its mother as token of her own authentication. There is, however, hardly any reason for her to serve as go-between for it to become autonomous and authentic in its turn. In such close combat, the symbolic light of a third party, eventually the father, can contribute, helps the future subject, the more so if it happens to be endowed with a robust supply of drive energy, in pursuing a reluctant struggle against what, having been the mother, will turn into an abject, repelling, rejecting, repelling itself, rejecting itself, abjecting. In this struggle, which fashions the human being, the mimesis, by means of which he becomes homologous to another in order to become himself, is in short logically and chronologically secondary, even before being like, I am but do not separate, reject, abject, abjection, with a meaning broadened to take in subjective diachrony, is a precondition of narcissism. It is coexistent with it and causes it to be permanently brittle. The more or less beautiful image in which I behold or recognize myself rests upon an objection that sunders it as soon as repression, the constant watchman, is relaxed.